level. And in that sub-basement is where the vault was. And as we now know, the FEMA videographer who went down into that hole saw that the vault had been broken open and that the vault had been cleaned out. That's why they attacked gold at criminal evidence, primarily criminal evidence. So now we switch over to the cover-up. 9/11 happened 14 years ago, but the cover-up is ongoing. And the cover-up is being done by people in the U.S. government, people in the military, by our media. That is criminal. And so as Mr. Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Because in the cover-up, we can see exactly who's doing what. We don't know who put the nanothermite in the World Trade Center yet, but we do know who's covering it up. And here are the two main suspects. John Ashcroft, Attorney General at the time, his assistant, Michael Chertoff, a son of the Mossad, Israeli national, loyalty to the State of Israel. He was put in charge. Michael Ashcroft was put in charge of the investigation. The non-investigation is what I call it, because there was no investigation. Rather than investigate the crime, he allowed the FBI, which is serving him, underneath him in the DOJ, he allowed them to turn over the evidence to the city of New York, who then promptly destroyed it. Now this is the crime scene where 2,700 people were killed. You don't just destroy the evidence from a crime scene of mass murder. That's criminal. For his good work in covering it up, he then went on to become the head of Homeland Security, the second one after the guy from Pennsylvania. And here he became the Homeland Security czar in March 2005. What's interesting to note here is that even in this position, when he became the head of Homeland Security, he still maintained his ironclad control over the evidence. Due to a provision in the Homeland Security Act, he was in charge of the evidence. So as an investigative journalist, I was always asking questions about evidence, and I was always being told, we can't tell you anything because it's ongoing criminal proceedings, etc. What they were doing is just destroying the evidence and withholding the evidence, and that's what they've done all along. This is Philip Zelikow, the man in the middle with the blue tie. He's the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission report. He was also the senior counsel to Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. And here they're meeting with Ehud Olmert. And I want to show you this because this is before they went into war with Iraq in 2003. And we're talking about weapons of mass destruction. And he says, I'll tell you what I think the real threat is and actually has been since 1990. This is the Iraqi threat. It's the threat against Israel. So the United States went in and neutralized the military of Iraq to protect Israel, not to protect the United States. There was no United States interest in war with Iraq. Here's Zelikow. As I said, he wrote the 9/11 Commission report, and what happened is he actually created the outline and wrote the report before the staff even began writing. So he had created this entire framework of the myth, and then simply cherry-picked the evidence and the testimony that would fit into that myth. That's what it is. Another man involved in the cover-up is this man, Gene Corley. He was in charge of this document where they investigated the buildings, how the buildings stood up against the impact, what have you. And I asked him, he's from Illinois, he's a concrete specialist. And I asked him, Mr. Corley, are you testing the steel to see if there's any evidence of explosives or explosions? And he says, I know nothing about that. I'm not a metallurgist. But all that was left at ground zero was metal. So why was this man chosen to do this job? Probably for the same reason that he was chosen to do the Waco study and the Oklahoma City study. He wrote both cover-ups for Waco, the Waco massacre, and Oklahoma City bombing. So his real specialty is covering up. He's passed away of cancer. This is another man. This is a genius with advanced weapons. He's got a resume as long as my arm about development of exotic weapons for the U.S. military and DARPA and other executive branch offices. And in 2005, he was put in charge of NIST, N-I-S-T, which is part of the Department of Commerce. It's called National Institute of Standards and Technology. They were given the task of writing the report on the collapse of the World Trade Center, why the towers collapsed. This report is a whitewash. It doesn't even discuss molten metal. It doesn't discuss explosions. Doesn't discuss evidence of thermite. Nothing. Well, this man was the person in charge of writing the report. His name is William Jeffrey, formerly Jaffe. His parents were Russian Jews, but they changed the name to Jeffrey, moved to Illinois from Florida, from New York, Florida, and then came to Illinois, where they then started a new life as Roman Catholics, portrayed themselves as the Jeffreys and Catholics. And then after a few years of that, they moved back to New York and carried on with his Rothschild career. What's interesting about this man who oversaw the creation of this fraudulent report is that he is now the CEO of a company called SRI, which is a nonprofit Stanford Research Institute based in Menlo Park, California, where they're a nonprofit research and development for the U.S. military. What's interesting about that is that they make nanothermite day in and day out. They develop and produce energetic nanocomposites exactly like what was found in the World Trade Center dust. And the person who runs the laboratory at SRI is this Israeli fella on the right, who's been there and making these things since 1984. Just to give you an idea of how old this research that produces nanothermite is. It's been going on for decades, but it's just getting into the public consciousness now. Most people don't even know what nanotechnology really means. They know it means small, but that's about the extent of it. This is what the nanocomposite looked like that was found in the dust. It was a bi-layered material, a red layer and a silver layer, which indicates that it may have been a foil, like a tin foil. And the red layer is the thermetic layer. The gray layer is an iron-rich layer that contains organic compounds. So that when the top layer burns, and it burns at the speed of an explosion, that quickly, it produces gas. And that explosive creation of gas is what pulverized the World Trade Center. This is what it looked like in the photographs taken by Professor Jones. These are micrographs. And when they found these little chips, they thought at first that it was like a paint. They thought it was some sort of primer. But when they exposed this chip to temperature of 430 degrees, it exploded. And when it exploded, it created a little tiny ball of iron. This just gives you an example of how these aluminothermetic reactions, the top four things are aluminothermic reactions. The top one is aluminum and molybdenum trioxide. This is probably what caused those little tiny balls of molybdenum. That would explain the presence of those little tiny spheres of molybdenum. Because when that reaction occurs, you get molten molybdenum. This shows you the energy potential. The red bar is giving you an example of how much energy is created by these aluminothermics. The bottom four things are high explosives. So you can see that the energy yield of nanocomposite energy weapons is much stronger than high explosives and can do things like this. All 220 floors of the World Trade Center were pulverized, and the metal pans, the 4 inches of concrete, and the metal pans that held them were turned into dust. And the dust rolled through Manhattan, and this is what you would call pyroclastic clouds, meaning that they contain fire. Because these clouds contained all those little tiny droplets of molten iron, either in the molten state or just turned into hardened steel. So when this hot dust hit cars, for example, it would scorch the car. It would scorch the side that got hit first, right? And when people got hit by this dust, they got burned. Like William Rodriguez, he was hiding under he went for protection under a fire truck, and when the blast hit him, it burned his leg, because these dust clouds contained molten iron. And obviously, they pulverized everything in the tower and everything that was on those floors. Nothing was found of these people. These 2,700 people just basically vanished into dust. Nothing was found. Nothing. Yet there were 3,000 families who had wrongful death cases. And those people were all settled out of court. The first 2,900 cases were settled out of court with federal compensation. They took the money and signed. There were then 96 families who held out for a court process. These 96 families appeared in the court of Alvin K. Hellerstein in New York, in the District Court of New York. There's a problem here, though, is that Alvin K. Hellerstein had a conflict of interest. His son worked for the key defendant in the tort litigation. His son lives in Israel and is a lawyer for an Israeli company who works for the Rothschild company that owned ICTS, International Consultants of Targeted Security, who controlled airport security on 9/11 in this country. So when these characters went in through Boston Airport, Newark Airport, Dulles Airport, wherever they got on, they went through Israeli security from a Dutch company, an Israeli Dutch company. It's just based in Holland. A Mossad company, owned by the Rothschilds. This company was the key defendant in the tort litigation because the families wanted to know, how did the 19 Arabs get on the planes? With the Arabs and the box cutters, with everything. How did they get on the planes? And ICTS, this Israeli company, would have had to answer that information, would have had to give the evidence. What did the judge do? Hellerstein, in his court in New York, he excused the company. He said, "You're just a parent company. I don't know what you're doing here. You can go home." And his son in Israel is working for that company. This is a fundamental primary family conflict of interest and is a strong ethical violation. But no matter how much I shouted about this, I couldn't get the authorities or the newspapers in New York to pay any attention. Finally, Ellen Mariani's lawyer took it to the Supreme Court and simply said that I want this information to be put into the document. Into the document. That's all we're asking. The U.S. Supreme Court denied it, and they said they scolded the lawyer, and they said you're anti-Semitic. Simply for trying to get this information into the court record. So the people who were responsible for this, what I call a judicial war of attrition, in which all of the families, you have to understand, there were 3,000 families, lost 3,000 people, and not a single case ever went to court. How can it be in this country, huh? Well, it's because Kenneth Feinberg, a big Zionist, he oversaw the special compensation fund. He gave the money to every single family, in which mum's the word, you can't talk about how much you got, no, terms cannot be discussed, you have to just take the money, shut up, and go home. End of discussion. That's what they did with the first 2,900 families. The other 96 families had to deal with Sheila Birnbaum down here, a partner with Skadden Arps, a legal firm that is very close to the state of Israel. And she worked with those 96 families. And one by one, that's like 3 times as many people are here, one by one, each family was settled out of court. Every family was settled out of court. So there will never be a 9/11 case trial in this country, because everybody that had standing has been settled. That's called a travesty of justice. This man was also involved in the 9/11 saga. He's the former Attorney General. He also belongs to the same Zionist Orthodox congregation that Judge Hellerstein belongs to. It's called the Kehilat Jeshurun, I think it's called, in Manhattan. It's Orthodox Zionist. This man presided over the first bombing in the World Trade Center in 1993. Remember, when the FBI basically created the sting operation, put the bomb in the building, and then paid $1 million to an Egyptian colonel to basically snare a bunch of Muslims into his orbit, who would then be indicted and charged with the crime. The blind cleric, remember the blind sheikh? Those guys went to jail for like the next 5,000 years. But he's the man who oversaw this case. The purpose of the 1993 bombing was to put into our heads that Arabs are trying to blow up the World Trade Center. So when it did happen 8 years later, we said, oh yeah, sure. Didn't you see the movie? In the end, the guy says, next time we'll bring them both down. And so that when it happened, people automatically, oh yeah, the Arabs did it, sure, who else? What other case he presided over was Larry Silverstein's case with the insurance companies. Remember, Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center, he only got like 4 weeks before, was suing the insurance companies for double indemnity, saying that this is 2 attacks, not 1. I want twice the money. In his courtroom of this Zionist Orthodox Jew, he got double indemnity. He got like $7.5 billion for buildings that had been public buildings only a month before, which he had put down only $100 million of borrowed money from GMAC to get. And he becomes a billionaire overnight. 9/11 is a crime within a crime within a crime. Believe me, it's multifaceted, and it's deep. And it's like a Russian Matryoshka doll, that you open it up, and inside there's another doll, another doll, another doll. In the middle of the doll, you get to the Israeli Zionist doll. You pass through Arabs and Russians and Chinese and German death cults and Alex Jones and a lot of other things. But when you get to the very inner core of the Matryoshka doll, the core, you find the Israelis. So that's the purpose of my information in my book, is I cut to the chase. I find who's really responsible for 9/11. And what we find at every key point in this crime, it's either a Zionist, an Israeli agent himself, or an American Zionist who is very closely connected to the highest level of the Israeli government. These are not just like people who have a warm and fuzzy feeling for the state of Israel. These are people who are connected to the very top. Like this man, Mr. Bloomberg, served 3 terms, unprecedented, mayor of New York for 12 years after 9/11, suppressed all discovery of the crime, threatened the police, threatened the firefighters, suppressed the information. Here he is, a close friend of Ehud Barak. When Ehud Barak was bombing, this is when he's dropping white phosphorus on the people of Gaza. Bloomberg goes there and holds his hand and says, it's okay, we understand. Sometimes those Palestinians need some white phosphorus. I guess that's just, they just won't listen.